Nicole Houchin was an Army wife whose marriage had turned into a war zone.
We were fighting about everything. We were not getting along at all.
John McKay was a professional soldier struggling through his own rocky relationship.
He felt boxed in. He wasn't having fun at home with his wife.
When these two lonely and frustrated coworkers met, sparks flew, and both realized they'd found the excitement they'd been missing from their lives.
The sex was out of this world.
Incredibly intense, a lot of adrenaline.
Their lust ignited an affair that fulfilled their wildest fantasies. But it wasn't long before their lives would come crashing back to reality.
She goes, "That bitch was in my house. That bitch was in my bed."
And when one of their spouses fell victim to a gruesome crime,
It was a slow, drawn-out death.
it suddenly put their bed hopping in a much more sinister light. Now get an insider's perspective to how police unraveled this scandalous tale of sex and infidelity. To determine whether this truly was a crime of passion
She was obsessed with the relationship.
or a cold and calculated plot that led to murder.
The whole thing is just bizarre.
July 27th, 2013, Williamsburg, Virginia. It was just before 6 p.m. in a quiet middle-class neighborhood. A neighbor of Dana McKay's received a call from Dana's mother, asking if she'd mind going next door to check up on Dana.
She hadn't heard from her, so she was concerned.
Using a spare key, the next-door neighbor entered the McKay home. Almost immediately, she noticed that something was very wrong.
The house is a wreck.
Stuff was all over the place, which wasn't like Dana because she kept a really spotless house.
The neighbor made her way upstairs, calling out to Dana along the way.
She went upstairs to a bedroom where she found what appeared to be a door that had been kicked in.
Inside the bedroom, Dana McKay's neighbor discovered why she hadn't heard any response. Dana lay motionless on the floor.
She was face down and naked, and there was a significant amount of blood.
A call to 911 brought first responders running. They confirmed the worst.
Dana had been murdered.
The extent of Dana McKay's injuries was jaw-dropping.
Evidence of stab wounds on her face and her hands, blunt force trauma to the head.
And just a few feet from the body, investigators made a horrific discovery.
The police discovered also that her finger was cut off. No one could understand why that would happen.
Police were baffled. Dana McKay seemed like the last person in the world who would die this way.
Who would even do this to Dana? She's such a loving person.
But they had no way of knowing that unraveling the mystery behind this brutal murder would reveal a twisted tangle of perverse loyalties and murderous passions. Born in 1978, Nicole Houchin's carefree youth was a constant search for the next good time.
She was looking for an escape, for fun, excitement.
And Nicole found just that when she began dating a local high school bad boy. Surprisingly, their teenage romance endured. And after graduation, they settled down and started a family.
I turned 18 in July. He turned 18 October 21st, 96, and that's the day we got married.
At first, the young couple couldn't have been happier. But when Nicole gave birth to a daughter, the responsibilities of parenthood weighed unevenly on the young couple. By late 2001, 23-year-old Nicole was pregnant with her second child. The pressures of maintaining both a marriage and a family proved too much for her husband to take, and their relationship fell apart. Nicole was now faced with the frightening reality of supporting her family alone.
I was pregnant with my son, and I needed a job.
Soon after Nicole landed a job in retail, she caught the eye of a young male coworker, 22-year-old Nace Houchin.
She was beautiful, blonde, really smart, a lot of charisma.
At first, Nicole had little interest in returning Nace's attention.
He was not my type at all.
But Nace persisted, working his way into Nicole's heart through the two things that mattered most to her: her daughter, and now newborn son.
I fell in love from the time that I met her, dedicated myself to her. I treated her like a goddess.
The pair began dating, and Nicole was in awe of her new man's willingness to be a good dad to her kids.
He was just an amazing father. He raised me.
She and Nace were married in 2007. Nicole left her job and stayed at home to raise their kids in a modest home in Williamsburg, Virginia.
I took her 2 kids in. She taught me how to be a husband.
But money soon became a challenge. After a year of just getting by, Nace made a decision that he hoped would provide much-needed financial stability for his family.
He joined the military. The family needed support.
But the additional income came at a high price. Less than 6 months after enlisting, Nace was deployed to Korea for a year, then to Kuwait. The long absences were difficult for Nicole.
She missed Nace being gone all the time.
I had told myself I'd never be married to a military man. So when he left, that's when my depression and stuff started.
By March of 2013, Nicole began to fear that their marriage was in trouble.
We were not getting along at all. We were fighting about everything.
Most of their fights were about money. Nace chose the service to become a better provider. But supporting a family of 4 stretched his paychecks to their limit. No matter how badly Nace wanted to be the family's only breadwinner, the bottom line was obvious.
She had to get a job.
Nicole returned to retail, taking a job at a local auto parts store. There, she discovered the extra income came with some surprising perks. Her husband's long absence had left her feeling lonely and disconnected, but her close-knit coworkers made her feel appreciated. She particularly hit it off with stocky and handsome 43-year-old John McKay. Soon, the 2 coworkers stayed in touch even when they weren't at work.
We exchanged numbers and basically we were just going to talk, just texting.
Like Nicole, John had also taken the auto parts job to help support a family. He'd been married to his wife Dana since 1993.
They meet, fall in love.
But just as Nace and Nicole had learned, supporting a family didn't come cheap, even without kids.
He has the pressure of supporting his wife.
And like Nace Houchin, John's solution to family money woes was to heed Uncle Sam's call. Rising to the rank of staff sergeant and the accompanying pay grade helped his family stay in the black.
Everything seemed to be pretty much okay. He had a fairly decent position in the U.S. Army.
John and Dana settled into a quiet life together on track to retirement.
It was just the 2 of them. They had 2 little dogs, and those are like their kids.
But by the time they reached their 20th wedding anniversary, John began to feel that their life was too quiet.
Sometimes when you're married to somebody for 20 years, things may appear to get stale.
And to make matters worse, Dana fell prey to chronic health problems.
Dana was very sick. She was having something wrong with the fluid draining in her brain throughout the body.
The unending demands on John to shepherd Dana to and from doctor's visits and to live by her bedside as a virtual shut-in widened the gap that had grown between them.
Dana was usually either in bed, resting, at the hospital.
Dana's medical bills were piling up fast, and their insurance was only covering a small fraction. So John had to moonlight from Army duty just to make ends meet.
The military is not that lucrative of a career, and he's forced to take a part-time job.
Like Nicole, working at the auto parts counter became both a financial boost and a social outlet. Their playful banter helped John to keep his mind off his problems and to feel like a man again.
She was younger than him. She was paying attention to him. It's flattering.
Long chats at work, followed by endless texts and emails from home, cemented a deep underlying connection.
You had John, who was unhappy in his marriage, and then Nicole, who was also unhappy in her marriage.
By May of 2013, after 2 months of flirtation, the chemistry between John and Nicole was just too much to resist. Both felt trapped in their marriages and far from where they had hoped to be at this point in their lives. The way they shared the same dreams, laughed at the same jokes, even finished each other's sentences, made it feel as though they were made for each other. Finally, the co-workers turned confidants went from sharing hobbies and heartaches to sharing a bed.
We just took it a step further.
It became an affair.
Their intimacy was sweet relief from Nicole's anxieties about her marriage. John's caress harkened back to good times, now so very long ago.
It was an escape to have fun.
And for heartsick John, Nicole was a high-energy distraction from a loveless marriage to a woman whose tragic illness had forced him into the role of caretaker instead of husband.
Here's this girl that's attracted to him.
Incredibly intense and passionate, a lot of adrenaline.
What Nicole now shared with John was powerful, passionate, and new. After 2 unhappy marriages, her romance with John finally fulfilled the promise of a youth spent in search of good times.
It was just supposed to be fun.
John told Nicole that in less than a year, he would be reassigned to another army base. And when it came time to leave, he wanted Nicole, not Dana, to come with him as his wife.
John asked me to marry him. He wanted to get divorced.
They thought they would live happily ever after.
But after a few weeks, their romantic bubble burst. John's conscience began to get the better of him. He'd taken a vow to be faithful to his wife, just as he had sworn to defend his country. What he had with Nicole may have felt good, but it didn't make it right.
He's got a great wife at home that absolutely loves him. He told Nicole that between him and her were over, that he could not continue.
With a heavy heart, John told Nicole that in spite of their plans, they would have to make do with just being friends. John was bound and determined to find a way to make his marriage to Dana work.
They were reconciled and everything was going to be okay.
Nicole was heartbroken. But once the reality of the situation set in, she decided to make the best of it. If the man she so admired and trusted could put his best foot forward, so could she. Instead of making impossible plans that would destroy 2 marriages, Nicole recommitted to her union with Nace.
I was contemplating just staying with my husband.
The 2 now former lovers hoped that neither Dana nor Nace would ever know how close they came to dual divorces. But no one could see that a perfect storm of greed, passion, and violence would soon consume both couples. Coming up, police come to a horrifying realization about Dana's death.
Those type of murders are generally done by people that know the victim.
And a baffling crime scene yields an all-important clue.
When they moved the body, they did find a small piece of blue latex that appeared to come from your glove.
From the moment they met, 34-year-old Nicole Houchin and 43-year-old John McKay hit it off and quickly became lovers.
She was younger than him. She was paying attention to him. It's flattering.
She was looking for an escape, for fun, excitement.
Unfortunately, both were married to other people.
He found himself being boxed in, which he wasn't having fun at home with his wife.
For a time, their pillow talk was devoted to making a fresh start and forging a new life together.
Sean and I were talking about getting married. He wanted to get divorced.
They're going to move away together.
But after a few weeks, reality set in. John vowed to return to his invalid wife, Dana, leaving Nicole to make the best of it with her husband, Nace. But on the evening of July 27, 2013, a violent murder would stun their community and put both couples in harm's way. Just after 6 p.m., a concerned neighbor discovered the body of John's 42-year-old wife, Dana McKay, inside the McKay's Williamsburg home.
She walked upstairs and found Dana in a pool of blood.
Once investigators arrived on the scene, they confirmed that Dana was dead. And multiple blunt force injuries and stab wounds told them her death wasn't just a murder, it was a bloodbath.
She was face down and naked, and there was a significant amount of blood.
But that wasn't the end of the brutality.
They discovered that a finger had been severed.
The gruesome detail had investigators baffled. Why would Dana's attacker remove one of her fingers? Was this some kind of ritual or message?
It is odd. It just doesn't make any sense.
No one can understand why that would happen.
Investigators turned their attention to the finger itself. When they looked closely at the wounds, the nature and the angle of the cuts told them the finger was collateral damage. It had, they decided, been violently sheared off when Dana desperately attempted to shield herself from the relentless blows and slashes that killed her.
Yeah, it certainly appeared that the finger was removed in the struggle. Those things are indicative of someone who's fighting for their life.
But what kind of person would perform such a heinous and brutal attack? And why? To get their answer, police performed a painstaking search of the McKay home's plundered ground floor.
The downstairs was completely ransacked.
Details supported a dawning theory that the savage murder was the climax of a home invasion gone catastrophically wrong.
It looks like a robbery.
Dana's attacker had apparently tampered with the lock on the door leading from the garage into the house.
It appeared that someone could have entered using a credit card or something to pick their way in.
And the door to the upstairs bedroom, where Dana was killed and dismembered, indicated a less subtle entrance.
They kicked the bedroom door open. It had been locked, and they kicked it in.
But detectives still couldn't tell what the supposed robbers had taken, where they'd gone, or who they were. A final piece of crime scene evidence, found as the medical examiner prepared to transport Dana's body to the morgue, just begged more questions.
When they moved the body, they did find a small piece of blue latex.
Added together, the clues police had found didn't paint a very clear picture of what happened.
There wasn't much forensic evidence that was able to be collected at the scene.
Police were puzzled. The condition of the house suggested a robbery motive, but detectives couldn't find signs that anything was missing. And years of experience told homicide investigators that the degree of violence with which Dana met her fate suggested a personal connection between her and the killer.
The brutality of the murder. Those type of murders are generally only done by people that know the victim.
The most personal connection Dana had was with her 43-year-old Army Staff Sergeant husband, John McKay. But John had been out of town during the murder.
John McKay was in New York at the time visiting family.
When John received news of his wife's murder, he cut his visit short and came home as fast as he could.
He came down immediately.
He's just devastated.
Pressed for names, John told police that there was no one in their lives he could think of that might have meant his wife harm.
Dana doesn't have an enemy in the world. He don't know who in the world would even do this.
Police remained at square one. So far, nothing they'd learned had ruled out the home invasion scenario. Dana may well have simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, even safe at home.
It was a robbery gone wrong.
It must have been just some random act of violence.
But as detectives mapped out their search for Dana's random executioner, the far more complex and personal truth of who killed Dana McKay and why lie hidden right under their noses. Coming up, investigators uncover deadly ambitions.
They did heavily fantasize about killing for weeks on end.
And gossip becomes a smoking gun.
She just said, that bitch was in my house, that bitch was in my bed.
Army Staff Sergeant John McKay and Army wife Nicole Houchin had bonded over their unhappy individual marriages. Nicole felt unsupported and abandoned by her frequently absent husband, Nace. John felt overwhelmed by his wife Dana's burgeoning health problems.
His marriage was falling apart, and I was on the verge of divorce.
The affair grew so passionate that the two entertained romantic notions of running away together and getting married themselves.
Eventually, we were talking about it being more permanent.
They love each other.
But it didn't take long for reality to set in. John went back to life with Dana, and Nicole settled back with her husband, Nace. But on the evening of July 27th, one of the obstacles keeping John and Nicole apart violently went away. Responding to a neighbor's call, police discovered John's wife, Dana McKay, viciously bludgeoned and stabbed to death inside the couple's Williamsburg home.
She had blunt force trauma, primarily to the head.
One of her fingers had been cut off.
Other than the obvious signs that McKay's home had been broken into and ransacked, the crime scene had offered up little more than a single clue.
There was a piece of a blue latex glove.
John, who had been out of town during the murder, had an alibi and no idea who might have slaughtered his wife.
He can't imagine who would even do this to Dana. She's such a loving person.
Police canvassed the ordinarily peaceful and tight-knit community. Neighbors said they saw nothing out of the ordinary on the night of the murder. But investigators learned that Dana herself had been troubled by events she'd witnessed leading up to her savage murder. And the suspicious activity Dana observed was inside her home. Despite being bedridden, a few weeks before her murder, Dana had managed to attend a family funeral out of town. Dana told neighbors that when she returned, she was surprised to discover John doing a chore he'd always ignored.
He was trying to wash the sheets because he never does laundry.
And the couple's fridge was stocked with unfamiliar goodies.
She found wine coolers in the refrigerator. She don't drink wine coolers.
According to the neighbors, Dana had come to a devastating conclusion.
Her husband was having an affair on her.
Friends told police that when Dana confronted John, her husband admitted the truth. He'd been having an affair with his co-worker, 34-year-old Nicole Houchin.
She found out that Nicole had stayed the night at their house.
She just said, "That bitch was in my house. That bitch was in my bed."
Detectives were investigating a murder, not an affair. But now they wondered, if John hadn't told them about his indiscretion, what else might he have neglected to tell police? 2 days after Dana's murder, police brought both John McKay and Nicole Houchin to the station for questioning. Nicole dug in her heels right away.
I didn't lawyer up, but I didn't tell him anything.
John, meanwhile, admitted to his fling with Nicole, but assured detectives that it was over and done.
John was basically stating that the relationship had cooled off. He had felt that he needed to stay with Dana.
The interviews netted police little more than a suspicion that one or both of the supposedly ex-lovers wasn't telling the whole story. Then, police received word that someone had come forward with a story to tell and physical evidence to share.
This person stepped forward to investigators and showed them a phone.
The man was an Army colleague of John's. He explained to police that John had lent him a cell phone when his own had broken. John had assured his Army buddy that John's account and personal information had all been erased. But when John's colleague attempted to set up his email on the phone John lent him, he discovered John hadn't been very thorough.
Apparently, he still had left a working email account on there.
Thinking John may have left the emails intact for a reason, his friend began reading them. And once John's friend read the contents, he went straight to the police.
I opened up the emails and saw the emails. I knew something was wrong.
They'd been exchanging hundreds, if not thousands, of messages.
Discussions about how much they love each other, how much they want to be with each other.
The steamy correspondence continued well after the point at which John said he and Nicole had cooled things down between them. And as the dates on the emails moved closer to the day of Dana's murder, John and Nicole's email relationship seemed to take a turn for the sinister.
They had been fantasizing about getting Dana Patterson McKay out of the picture, about life together without her.
In the last email that John had sent to Nicole, he specifically asks if she will be gone before I get back.
Nicole's reply appeared to seal the unsavory deal.
Last response to John was that she's trying to make it happen as soon as possible.
Police now believe they had proof that John and Nicole were involved in the brutal slaying of John's wife, Dana.
That's a fairly damning piece of evidence.
They had something to do with her murder.
But just how much did they know? And how deeply were they involved? While the emails certainly indicated that John and Nicole had knowledge of the death, they didn't conclusively state what the couple knew or what they did. Detectives put the question to Nicole. Just how could she account for the threatening exchanges?
They were simply just emails, they were just harmless talk. There was never any real intention to follow through with any of the discussions of harming Dana.
But when investigators went at John in the interrogation room, he began to play ball. While John maintained that he had nothing to do with his wife's murder, he admitted to detectives that deep down, he couldn't be sure about his girlfriend Nicole.
He felt that she had a motive. She may be responsible for murdering his wife.
John explained that he and Nicole had planned to get married, but that those plans were torpedoed when his wife learned of their affair.
Dana would not grant him a divorce.
In fact, Dana told John she had a plan of her own. If he didn't end his affair with Nicole immediately and permanently, she would take advantage of the Army's strict moral policy on adultery and report him.
She lays down the law to John and tells him she's going to go to his commander.
John knew that being found guilty of adultery could put him in an Army stockade for a year, cost him his rank, and even his pension. His good name, career, and finances would go up in smoke.
John saw his reputation going down the drain, his pension possibly, and all those years he had spent in the military.
John would have walked out with nothing.
John told police he was forced to break the devastating news to Nicole. Their illicit romance would have to end. John couldn't endure an Army Review Board scrutiny and the loss of the status and pension he'd worked for decades to earn.
He did tell her that he wasn't going to leave his wife, that he couldn't leave her.
According to John, Nicole took the news badly. Her own marriage was in name only.
My husband and I were separated. We still lived in the same house, but slept in different bedrooms.
She had built a world around John and their future together.
She was just devastated. She was emotionally tied up into John. She wanted him.
She was obsessed with the relationship.
John told police that he thought Nicole was on the road to repairing her own marriage to Nace. But he said that Nicole's constant calls and her behavior at work after their breakup had made him wonder if she was having trouble letting go of their affair. Could his girlfriend have been involved in his wife's death?
Basically, John had put the blame more so on Nicole, and she felt that Dana was a hindrance in them being able to romantically get further involved, and that, she was all behind it and that he knew nothing of it happening.
John described a phone conversation he'd shared with Nicole while he was in New York visiting family that had all but confirmed his suspicions.
Nicole calls him to let him know that it's done.
But John assured police that it was only after Dana was found dead that he understood what Nicole meant. When he realized that his affair could have led to Dana's death, the Army lifer told police he was devastated.
He felt guilty, he felt responsible, but was certainly pointing the finger at Nicole for the murder.
Police saw things differently.
All of those things tie together to certainly support that they were involved.
John's innocent act didn't stop detectives from arresting both him and Nicole. But with John in New York, how had slim and petite Nicole dispatched Dana so violently that the victim lost a finger in the struggle?
And it had to be someone fairly strong, and Nicole is not a very big girl.
Investigators were left with one troubling conclusion.
There has to be another person.
Coming up, a shocking confession from a surprising source forces police to reconsider their suspect list.
that there's a third person involved. The whole thing is just bizarre.
And a seemingly irrelevant piece of crime scene evidence suddenly assumes center stage.
They found blue latex in the front lawn.
Being married to other people hadn't stopped 34-year-old Nicole Houchin and 43-year-old Army Staff Sergeant John McKay from plunging into a torrid secret affair, or prevented them from planning a future together outside their shattered vows.
The whole affair was just an escape.
We just took it a step further. We definitely talked about it being more permanent.
But in July of 2013, John's 42-year-old wife Dana was the victim of a senseless, brutal attack that left her dead on the bedroom floor of the couple's Williamsburg, Virginia home.
She had been stabbed in the face several times. There was so much blood everywhere. It had to have been so incredibly violent.
She had blunt force trauma, primarily to the head. They also discovered that a finger had been severed.
After a concerned friend of John's had come forward with a series of damning emails between Nicole and John, police drew the obvious and unsettling conclusion. With his military career and pension hanging in the balance, John was forced to break up with Nicole. He assured police that his devastated ex had plotted to kill Dana without his knowledge. And yet the stockpile of emails John and Nicole exchanged in the weeks and days leading up to the murder told them differently.
They did heavily fantasize about killing her for weeks on end.
Nagging questions still lay between police and a likely conviction. With John out of town the night of the murder, just how a diminutive Nicole kicked in Dana's door and savagely beaten, stabbed, and dismembered John's wife on her own.
Nicole is pretty petite. It had to have been another person.
Until detectives found the mysterious additional conspirator, they wouldn't have a complete picture of Dana McKay's brutal execution. Forensic evidence from the crime scene offered up few answers.
They found really no physical evidence.
In fact, other than Dana's severed finger and a tampered-with lock, the crime scene only yielded a single clue.
They found part of the blue latex glove beneath Dana McKay's body.
But the glove bore no prints, fibers, hairs, or other trace evidence that might help connect the dots. Then, on September 17th, detectives got new evidence from an unlikely place. A patrol officer had pulled over and arrested a 33-year-old Army specialist on suspicion of driving a stolen truck. Police subsequently examined the man's own truck parked outside his home. What they found made them reach out to homicide detectives.
During a search of the vehicle, they discovered what appeared to be a confession note.
The note was a written admission to the murder of Dana McKay. But even more shocking than the contents of the note was the identity of the driver of the stolen truck and the author of the letter.
The person who wrote it is Nace Houchin.
Nace Houchin, the cheated-on husband of adulteress and murder suspect Nicole Houchin. Investigators were shocked.
Are you kidding? Her husband was in on it too? The husband that she was having an affair on.
Detectives wasted no time ushering Nace Houchin into an interrogation room. There, Nace tried his best to walk police through the reasoning behind the note.
Nace shared with them that it was actually a false confession.
Nace explained to police that a recent jail visit with Nicole had left him so distraught that he considered assuming her burden of guilt himself.
He felt bad for his wife's situation and that he wanted to take the blame.
Nace wrote the note, he told police, in a moment of misguided compassion.
I had to do something to help fix the situation, and so I wrote the letter.
But Nace insisted that he'd since come to his senses and realized the false confession was a bad idea.
I was so paranoid, I couldn't go to sleep. I was constantly looking out the window, wondering when the MP or the military or the investigator was gonna come pick me up.
However, he neglected to do one thing.
He meant to throw the note away, but he forgot and left it in the truck.
Investigators weren't so sure. Hard as it was to believe that a cuckolded husband could commit murder on behalf of his cheating wife and her lover, Nace had the muscle and the military training to get the dirty job done. And when detectives took a closer look at the cheated-on husband, they learned that marriage vows weren't any more of an obstacle for Nace than they had been for Nicole.
Nace apparently was also having an affair with another woman.
Both of them are cheating, so it's really crazy.
When police tracked down Nace's girlfriend, she told them that she'd questioned Nace about Dana's death.
She shared with police that she'd asked him multiple times, was he involved in this murder? He gave her vague answers.
But a few weeks after the murder, Nace showed up at her door visibly upset and singing a different tune.
One night, he showed up on her doorstep in tears.
When his girlfriend asked him what was wrong, Nace finally tearfully confessed the truth to his lover. Proof, they now turned to the Houchin home.
Investigators went to Fort Eustis.
Square inch of every room inside of Nace and Nicole's house, their search came up empty. But then, while examining the small yard outside the Houchin home, police unearthed a piece of evidence that just might establish the connection they needed.
They found blue latex in the front lawn.
Lab analysis confirmed that the scrap of synthetic rubber was the exact same material as the torn glove found underneath Dana McKay's lifeless, brutalized corpse.
It matched 100% the one that was found under Dana's body.
On November 15th, police charged Nace Houchin with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. But the case was still far from solved. In order to get justice for Dana McKay, police would need to untangle the unfathomable details of how and why Nace assisted Nicole and John in murdering Dana.
It's certainly unusual to enlist the help of your spouse to kill your boyfriend's wife.
Coming up, on the eve of their three-way murder trial, new details emerge.
If I die, I die, but if I can take her out too, I'm gonna. If I have a chance, I will kill her. No questions asked.
By the fall of 2013, John McKay and Nicole Houchin's extramarital affair going public was the least of their problems. Detectives in Williamsburg, Virginia believed they had sufficient proof to charge Nicole and John in the appalling, brutal murder of John's wife, Dana.
They were charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder.
Detectives were now certain that John and Nicole hatched a plan to kill Dana when she threatened to bring John up on charges of adultery in an Army court.
She was basically blackmailing him with his job.
The only way for them two to be together would be to get Dana out the picture.
And the lovers successfully recruited Nicole's husband, Nace Houchin, as the muscle to kill John's wife, Dana, while John established an out-of-town alibi. Investigators hoped that the discovery of a fragment of blue latex glove found on the Houchin's lawn that matched the torn glove underneath Dana's body would turn the three killers against each other. Now, months after Nicole's arrest, police got word from Nicole Houchin's attorney that their formerly tight-lipped client was ready to talk.
Nicole is the first to crack under pressure, and she lays out everything from top to bottom what happened.
Nicole confirmed what police already believed. She and John cooked up the murder together and got Nace to help. But investigators wondered what was in it for Nicole's estranged husband. According to Nicole, it was money. $20,000 in Dana's life insurance, split two ways.
When John proposed the money, the $20,000, they just saw dollar signs.
On the night of July 26th, she and Nace followed John's instructions on how best to break into his home.
They used a credit card to get inside the house.
According to Nicole, it was her husband Nace who, armed with a knife and a heavy automotive tool called a breaker bar, went upstairs where Dana lay asleep.
Once they're inside, Nace Houchin goes upstairs and kicks the door down.
And Nicole said it was Nace that did the gruesome deed.
He went in and he beat her to death.
While Nace savagely stabbed Dana and beat her with the breaker bar upstairs, Nicole had her own job to do on the first floor.
Ransacking the house, turning things over, making it seem like a robbery.
Nicole took pains to make it clear to police that her participation did not include the grisly murder itself.
I did not kill her. I did not commit that.
And over, through her detailed confession, Nicole made one more thing clear to law enforcement. Even though he wasn't there, John McKay had planned every step leading up to and away from his wife's murder.
John set up everything for the murder to happen.
He was the mastermind.
When word reached John that he had now been thrown under the bus, he had his own story to tell.
It wasn't long after Nicole confesses that John breaks down.
John confessed to conspiring with Nicole and Nace to murder his wife. After years of maintaining his innocence, he openly and publicly expressed remorse for his role in the plot.
If I spend the rest of my life in jail because of what happened to her, it won't be long enough.
By that spring, both John and Nicole had reached deals with prosecutors. In exchange for pleading guilty and testifying against Nace, they both avoided trial and the gas chamber.
Nicole and John took plea deals at the same time, on the same day. It was the same court docket, one right after the other.
In February of 2015, both John and Nicole officially pled guilty to first-degree murder. But neither of them seemed likely to let each other off the hook anytime soon.
At first, I was heartbroken. Because I did have feelings for the guy. I did love him. But then I was just really angry. Really angry. I was so mad. And hurt. I was hurt.
If I die, I die, but if I can take her out too, I'm gonna. If I have a chance, I will kill her. No questions asked.
Those who knew the people involved were left baffled by the bizarre crime and devastating loss of life it caused.
It seems unreal. It's just a tragedy all around.
It's essentially a callous disregard for human life.
July 22nd, 1933, was a Saturday night in Oklahoma City. Across the United States, the Great Depression had transformed ordinary life into something uncertain. Banks had failed, businesses had collapsed, families struggled to find work, and the distance between comfort and desperation seemed to grow wider every day. But inside one home in Oklahoma City, the evening appeared peaceful. Charles F. Urschel, a wealthy oil businessman, was spending the night with his wife. They were joined by Walter R. Jarrett and his wife, and the four of them were playing bridge on the screened porch of the Urschel home. It was the kind of evening that, from the outside, seemed entirely ordinary. There was nothing to suggest that within minutes, Charles Urschel would disappear into the darkness, that his family would be drawn into a desperate ransom negotiation, or that the investigation would eventually stretch across state lines and become one of the cases that helped define the expanding power of the federal government. At approximately 11:15 that night, two armed men suddenly entered the house. One carried a machine gun. The other carried a handgun. Their presence immediately transformed the atmosphere. The men were not there to steal valuables from the house. They were looking for one person. They asked a simple question: "Who is Mr. Urschel?" For a moment, no one answered. The question itself was frightening because everyone in the room understood what it meant. The men had come prepared, and they were not asking for directions. They wanted Charles Urschel. But there was a complication. The intruders were not immediately certain which of the two men in the room was their intended target. Walter Jarrett was there as a guest, and the kidnappers warned that if they could not identify Urschel, both men would be taken. The women were ordered not to call for help. There was no room for negotiation. Under the threat of firearms, Charles Urschel and Walter Jarrett were forced to leave the house. They were taken outside and placed in a Chevrolet sedan waiting nearby. For the two women who remained behind, the situation must have been terrifying in its simplicity. Their husbands had been taken from the safety of their own evening, and there was nothing they could immediately do to stop it. The kidnappers drove away with both men. For the moment, the distinction between Charles Urschel and Walter Jarrett did not matter. Both were prisoners, but somewhere beyond Oklahoma City, the kidnappers would determine which man they actually wanted. The decision came roughly 12 miles outside the city. The kidnappers realized that Walter Jarrett was not their intended victim. They released him, but the release was not an act of mercy. Before leaving him behind, they took $50 from Jarrett and warned him not to reveal the direction in which they had gone. Jarrett was suddenly alone, separated from the man who had been taken because of his wealth. Eventually, around 1 o'clock in the morning on July 23rd, he made his way back to the Urschel home. His return brought one terrible certainty. This was not an ordinary robbery. Charles Urschel was still missing. The family now had to confront the possibility that he had been deliberately selected, taken alive, and held somewhere beyond their reach. The case quickly came to the attention of the federal authorities. J. Edgar Hoover, then director of the Bureau of Investigation, the agency that would later become the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was contacted. Agents were sent to Oklahoma City, and the investigation began to expand. At that moment, however, the objective was not simply to capture the kidnappers as quickly as possible. The first priority was Charles Urschel. A violent confrontation could put his life at greater risk. The investigators, therefore, had to move carefully. They needed to understand who had taken him, where he might be held, what the kidnappers wanted, and how they could secure his release without turning the case into a bloodbath. This was 1933, an era when kidnapping had become one of the most frightening forms of organized crime in America. Wealthy citizens could be watched, followed, and abducted for enormous sums of money. Criminal groups could operate across state boundaries, making local police investigations far more difficult. The Urschel case would demonstrate precisely why such crimes demanded cooperation beyond the jurisdiction of a single city or state. And behind the investigation stood a criminal figure who was already becoming notorious. George Kelly Barnes, better known as George Machine Gun Kelly. Kelly had built a reputation through bootlegging and other criminal activities, and his name was becoming associated with the violent world of Depression-era organized crime. His wife, Catherine Thorne Kelly, also played an important role in his criminal activities and in the creation of the image that surrounded him. The machine gun associated with Kelly became part of his identity, and the nickname Machine Gun Kelly turned him into the kind of criminal figure newspapers could easily transform into a national sensation. But the mythology surrounding Kelly would eventually become less important than the evidence left behind by the crime itself. The kidnapping of Charles Urschel was not solved by a single dramatic confrontation. It would be solved through patience, observation, financial evidence, and the remarkable ability of a victim to remember details while deprived of one of the most important senses, sight. That part of the story had not yet begun on the night of July 22nd. At that moment, Charles Urschel was simply a man being driven away from his home by armed strangers. He did not know how long he would be gone. He did not know where they were taking him. He could not know what his family was experiencing as they waited for information. And he certainly could not know that the smallest details of his captivity would later become essential pieces of an investigation. The kidnappers believed that controlling his surroundings would give them control over the evidence. They could blindfold him. They could move him. They could keep him away from the outside world. They could prevent him from seeing the road, the buildings, and the landscape around him. But they could not completely prevent him from listening. They could not stop him from remembering. They could not erase the sound of an engine, the character of a road, the timing of a journey, the sound of aircraft overhead, the smell of oil, the presence of animals, or the feel and taste of water. Those details would later become a kind of invisible map. For now, however, none of that was known. The night remained dark. The Chevrolet was moving away from Oklahoma City, and Charles Urschel had disappeared into the hands of his kidnappers. What began as an ordinary game of bridge had become a federal kidnapping investigation. The question was no longer simply where Charles Urschel had been taken. The deeper question was whether he could be brought home alive, and before the case was over. The answer would depend on whether investigators could reconstruct a journey that the kidnappers believed they had successfully hidden, and whether the man they had tried to silence could remember enough to lead them back to the place where he had been held. Charles F. Urschel was not the kind of man who expected to become the center of a national criminal investigation. He was a wealthy oil businessman in Oklahoma City, a member of the city's prosperous upper class, and a man whose success was closely connected to the oil industry that had helped shape the region. His position also brought him into contact with prominent figures in the world of Oklahoma oil, including the well-known Tom Slick family. In 1933, that kind of wealth carried a meaning that was difficult to separate from the circumstances of the country around him. America was deep in the Great Depression. Economic hardship had spread across the nation, and the contrast between those who still possessed substantial wealth and those struggling to survive had become increasingly visible. For criminals willing to take enormous risks, wealthy businessmen represented something more than individual people. They represented potential ransom. Kidnapping had become an increasingly serious threat, and the idea was brutally simple. Take someone who could afford to pay, keep that person alive, demand money, and disappear before authorities could intervene. It was a crime that depended on fear. The kidnappers did not necessarily need to destroy their victim. They needed to convince the victim's family that cooperation was safer than resistance. Charles Urschel was therefore selected not because of something he had done, but because of what his financial position represented. His wealth made him valuable to people who saw kidnapping as a business. The men who ultimately targeted him were operating within a criminal environment that had become increasingly organized and dangerous. At the center of the case was George Kelly Barnes, the man who would become known throughout America as George Machine Gun Kelly. Kelly had not appeared suddenly as a criminal mastermind. His background included a succession of occupations before he entered more serious criminal activity. He became involved in bootlegging and bank robbery, and over time his reputation grew. The nickname that would make him famous was closely connected to the image surrounding him. The machine gun became part of his identity, and the name Machine Gun Kelly transformed him from another criminal into a figure who could be recognized almost instantly. But behind that public image was a man who was willing to participate in a crime requiring planning, secrecy, violence, and the cooperation of others. His wife, Catherine Thorne Kelly, was also an important part of his criminal world. She was not merely a distant observer of her husband's activities. According to the information available in this case, she played a role in his criminal operations and was associated with the machine gun that helped create his infamous nickname. Together, George and Catherine Kelly became associated with the kind of criminal enterprise that was becoming increasingly visible during the Depression era. Their world was built around money, illegal activity, and the willingness to use intimidation when necessary. Yet the Urschel kidnapping was different from many of the crimes that had previously contributed to Kelly's reputation. This time, the target was not property sitting inside a bank or goods that could be transported and sold. The target was a human being. Charles Urschel could be moved, hidden, and used as leverage against his family. His life became the most important piece of the criminal operation. The choice of Urschel also reflected the logic of ransom kidnapping. A wealthy businessman could potentially generate an enormous payment without requiring the kidnappers to rob a bank or openly confront law enforcement. Instead of forcing their way into a financial institution, they could enter a private home, seize one individual, and place the family under pressure. The danger for the victim was immediate, but for the kidnappers, the crime appeared to offer a path toward a huge reward. On the night of July 22, 1933, that plan moved from preparation to action. Urschel had been spending the evening with his wife, Walter R. Jarrett, and Jarrett's wife. They were playing bridge at the Urschel home. Nothing in the information available about that evening suggests that Urschel knew he had been selected, or that armed men were about to enter his home. Then, at approximately 11:15 p.m., two men appeared. One carried a machine gun. The other carried a handgun. They entered and asked, "Who is Mr. Urschel?" The question exposed the basic purpose of the operation. The men had not arrived to threaten everyone equally. They were searching for a particular individual. But their uncertainty about which man was Charles Urschel created a brief complication. Walter Jarrett was also present, and the kidnappers warned that if they could not identify Urschel, both men would be taken. The women were ordered not to call for help. Under the threat of firearms, Charles Urschel and Walter Jarrett were forced out of the home and into a waiting Chevrolet sedan. In that moment, the difference between the two men was irrelevant to the kidnappers. Both were potential captives until the intended victim could be identified. The decision was made only after they had driven approximately 12 miles away from Oklahoma City. Jarrett was released after the kidnappers determined that he was not the man they wanted. Before letting him go, they took $50 and warned him not to reveal the direction in which they had traveled. Urschel, however, remained in their custody. This distinction reveals the central calculation behind the crime. The kidnappers were not simply looking for victims at random. They had a specific financial objective, and Charles Urschel was the person they believed could provide it. Once Jarrett was released, the kidnapping entered a new phase. Urschel was alone with the people who had selected him. His family was left behind with no immediate certainty about his location or condition. At around 1 o'clock in the morning on July 23rd, Jarrett managed to return to the Urschel home. His arrival confirmed what everyone feared. Charles had not come back. The case was now unmistakably a kidnapping. For the Urschel family, the most frightening part was the absence of information. They did not know where Charles was being held. They did not know what the kidnappers wanted. They did not know whether he was injured, and they could not know how long the ordeal would last. The criminals, meanwhile, had the advantage they believed mattered most: control over the victim's physical surroundings. They could move him away from Oklahoma City. They could keep him out of sight. They could prevent him from communicating freely. They could make the outside world disappear. But the kidnapping contained a weakness the criminals could not easily see. Charles Urschel was not simply a passive object being transported from one place to another. He was observing. Even without knowing it, the kidnappers were leaving information behind every time they moved him. The sound of an engine could become a clue. A road could reveal something through its condition. Weather could establish a timeline. A smell could identify the environment. A machine operating nearby could indicate the kind of property where he was being held. Even the sound of an aircraft could later become meaningful. The men who kidnapped Urschel believed that removing his ability to see would help conceal their location. But blindness did not erase his memory. In the days that followed, he would begin collecting fragments of information without knowing exactly how those fragments might be used. At the time, however, the kidnappers appeared to have achieved what they wanted. A wealthy businessman had been taken from his home. His companion had been released. And Charles Urschel was somewhere beyond the reach of his family. The next step would be a demand for money. And that demand would transform the kidnapping from a terrifying disappearance into a race between criminals attempting to hide a trail and investigators determined to follow it. For Charles Urschel, the central task was no longer simply to endure his captivity. He would have to remember every sound, every movement, every small detail, because when he could finally see again, those memories might be the only map he had. The first hours after Charles F. Urschel was taken were defined by uncertainty. His family knew that he had been abducted, but they did not know where he was being held, who had taken him, or what the kidnappers intended to do with him. Walter R. Jarrett had returned to the Urschel home after being released approximately 12 miles outside Oklahoma City, carrying the information that the men had warned him not to reveal the direction in which they had gone. Jarrett had also lost $50 to the kidnappers, but the money was insignificant compared with what had happened to Charles Urschel. One man had been released because he was not the intended target. The other had disappeared. Around 1 o'clock in the morning on July 23rd, Jarrett made his way back to the Urschel home. The night that had begun with an ordinary game of bridge had ended with one family waiting for the return of a husband and friend who was now completely beyond their reach. For Charles Urschel, the world had become much smaller. He was in the custody of armed men who had deliberately taken him from his home because of his wealth. He could not simply walk away. He could not contact his family. And, most importantly, he could not see where he was. The kidnappers blindfolded him. From their perspective, this was a straightforward precaution. If Urschel could not see the roads, buildings, landscape, or people around him, then he would have far less information to give investigators after his release. A blindfold could conceal a location. It could prevent recognition. It could make a journey seem impossible to reconstruct. But the kidnappers made a critical mistake if they believed that removing sight meant removing evidence. Charles Urschel began paying attention to everything that remained available to him. He could not see, but he could listen. He could not observe the landscape with his eyes, but he could notice the condition of the journey through movement and sound. He could not examine a building visually, but he could remember its internal features. He could not read a sign or identify a road, but he could measure time and notice changes in his surroundings. His captivity lasted approximately 9 days, and during those 9 days, ordinary details became increasingly important. He remembered the sound of engines. He paid attention to how long journeys seemed to last. He noticed the condition of roads. He remembered the smell of oil. He noticed the sound of machinery, including the distinctive sounds associated with an oil-producing environment. He remembered rain and changes in the weather. He noticed animals and other sounds around the place where he was being held. He paid attention to the structure of the house, including the number of stairs. He remembered the sound of water from a well and even the taste of the water. These details might have seemed insignificant to someone simply trying to survive a kidnapping, but Urschel was doing something more. Without knowing precisely how investigators would eventually use his memories, he was creating a record in his mind. Each detail was a fragment. Alone, none of them could identify a location. Together, they could become something much more powerful. A sound could establish a type of environment. A journey could establish distance. Rain could establish a date. An aircraft overhead could establish a location if investigators knew where and when planes were flying. The smell of oil could suggest proximity to oil fields or machinery. The taste of water could later be compared with water from a particular well. A staircase, a cup, a chair, or a barn could become recognizable if investigators found the right property. The significance of these details would only become clear after Urschel was released. Until then, they were simply memories he carried with him. While Charles remained captive, the investigation outside continued to develop. Federal authorities had been brought into the case, and the Bureau of Investigation under J. Edgar Hoover faced a problem that was common to kidnapping cases, but especially difficult here. The investigators had almost no direct knowledge of the location of the victim. The kidnappers had taken Urschel away from his home, and the very nature of the crime depended on concealment. They wanted the family frightened enough to cooperate and the authorities uncertain enough to remain behind. The investigation, therefore, had to proceed without a visible crime scene containing the victim. There was no obvious building to search, no known road to follow, and no clear geographic destination. The kidnappers controlled the physical environment around Urschel, but they could not control the passage of time. They could not prevent him from hearing what happened around him. They could not stop rain from falling. They could not stop airplanes from passing overhead. They could not erase the sound of machinery, and they could not prevent a captive from remembering. For Urschel, those 9 days must have been measured differently from the way time was measured outside. For his family, each hour without information carried uncertainty. For investigators, each hour was an opportunity to learn something new. For the kidnappers, each hour was part of their effort to maintain control. And for Urschel himself, Every hour provided another chance to notice something that might later matter. His memories were not organized like a conventional map. They were fragments gathered through senses other than sight. He remembered sounds and smells. He remembered physical sensations and the passage of time. He remembered the environment around the house. He remembered details that might have been forgotten under ordinary circumstances precisely because the circumstances were anything but ordinary. The blindfold, intended to isolate him, forced him to concentrate on everything else. Eventually, the kidnapping moved toward its next stage. The criminals would communicate with the outside world and demand money for Urschel's release. But even before the ransom demand arrived, the most important evidence in the case was already being collected. It was being stored not in a document, a photograph, or a physical object, but in the memory of the man the kidnappers believed they had hidden. Approximately 9 days after his abduction, Charles Urschel would be released. By then, the criminals had succeeded in keeping him away from his family and preventing him from seeing where he had been held. But they had failed to accomplish something more important. They had failed to erase the journey from his mind. When investigators finally had the opportunity to question him, they would not be speaking to a man who knew nothing about his surroundings. They would be speaking to a witness who had spent 9 days transforming darkness into information. He could describe the sounds he had heard, the conditions he had experienced, the structure of the place where he had been kept, and the sequence of details that had surrounded him. The investigators would then face an unusual challenge. They would have to turn those fragments into geography. They would have to determine where aircraft had been flying, where rain had fallen, what areas matched the road conditions Urschel remembered, and what locations contained the physical features he could describe. The kidnappers had tried to create a world in which Charles Urschel could see nothing. Instead, they had created a situation in which he listened more carefully than he might ever have listened before. The result would become one of the most important elements of the investigation. The 9 days of darkness were not simply the period during which Charles Urschel was missing. They were the period during which the evidence against his kidnappers was quietly taking shape. And when the blindfold finally came off, the investigators would begin the difficult task of reconstructing a journey that had been deliberately hidden from sight. While Charles F. Urschel remained in captivity, the people outside the hidden location where he was being held were waiting for the kidnappers to reveal what they wanted. The answer would come in the form that kidnapping had increasingly taken during the Depression era: a ransom demand. The objective was not simply to take Urschel away from his home. He had been selected because he was wealthy, and the kidnappers intended to turn that wealth into a payment. Every day that passed without communication increased the uncertainty surrounding his disappearance. His family could not know whether the kidnappers would make contact, when they would make contact, or what conditions they would impose. Eventually, the criminals did make contact. On July 26, 1933, a package was sent through Western Union to J. G. Catlett, a wealthy oil businessman and close friend of Charles Urschel. Inside were letters that confirmed something the family already feared: Charles was alive, but he was being held for money. One of the letters had been written by Urschel himself. Another was addressed to his wife. The correspondence also contained instructions connected with the ransom. The demand ultimately reached $200,000, an extraordinary amount of money in 1933. The figure was designed to make the seriousness of the kidnapping unmistakable. The criminals were not asking for a small payment that could be produced quietly. They wanted a fortune, but the demand also created an opportunity for investigators. Every instruction from the kidnappers could provide information. Every movement of the ransom could potentially become evidence. The Bureau of Investigation had to balance two objectives that could easily conflict with one another. The first was the safe return of Charles Urschel. The second was the identification and capture of the people responsible. If investigators moved too aggressively, they risked provoking the kidnappers and endangering Urschel. If they simply paid the money without taking precautions, they could lose one of the most valuable opportunities to trace the criminals. The response was therefore deliberate. The ransom money was prepared using used $20 bills, and the serial numbers of the bills were recorded. This decision was crucial because the money itself could become a trail. Once the bills entered circulation, investigators could potentially identify where they appeared and begin reconstructing the movements of the people who possessed them. The criminals might believe that once they had the money, the evidence would disappear with it. But the serial numbers meant that the ransom was not simply currency. It had effectively been marked by information. Every $20 bill carried an identity that could later connect a person or transaction to the kidnapping. The investigators also prepared two identical-looking bags. One contained the actual ransom money. The other contained old magazines. The purpose was a precaution against the possibility that the kidnappers might attempt to seize the ransom bag directly or otherwise interfere with the exchange. The second bag provided a layer of protection and reflected the uncertainty of the situation. The authorities could not know exactly how the kidnappers would behave once the payment was made. They had already demonstrated their willingness to enter a private home with firearms and abduct a man. There was no reason to assume that the ransom exchange would be safe. The two bags therefore represented more than a simple trick. They reflected the broader strategy of the investigation: protect Urschel first, but at the same time create opportunities to identify the criminals. For Charles Urschel, however, the ransom was not an abstract figure. He was the person whose life had become the condition attached to that $200,000 demand. Somewhere away from his home, he remained captive while the outside world prepared to respond. His family had to confront the terrifying reality that the criminals had placed a price on his freedom. The letters sent through Western Union served as proof that he was still alive, but they also reinforced his helplessness. He could write, but he could not leave. His family could read his words, but they could not simply go to him. The kidnappers controlled the location, while the investigators controlled the response. The ransom negotiations, therefore, became a delicate balance between hope and fear. The authorities had to avoid creating a situation in which the criminals believed they were being deceived. At the same time, they had to ensure that the payment could later help reveal the network behind the crime. This was particularly important because the kidnapping was not necessarily the work of one isolated individual. The investigation would eventually uncover connections involving several people and multiple locations. The ransom money would become one of the threads connecting those individuals. The serial numbers recorded by investigators meant that the money could be followed after the kidnapping. Bills that appeared in banks or businesses could potentially be recognized. A payment made far from Oklahoma City could suddenly become relevant to the investigation. A person who possessed a bill that had been part of the ransom could become a link in the chain. A transaction involving the money could reveal contact with someone already suspected. In this way, the ransom became a kind of invisible tracking system. The criminals could physically carry the bills away, but they could not easily erase their identities. That distinction would become increasingly important as the investigation expanded. Yet none of this guaranteed a safe outcome. The kidnappers still had Charles Urschel. The investigators could prepare money, record serial numbers, and analyze every letter. But none of those measures could guarantee that the victim would survive. The first responsibility remained his safe return. That meant patience. The Bureau of Investigation could not treat the case like a conventional manhunt in which suspects could simply be surrounded and arrested. The location of the victim was unknown, and any sudden action could have consequences. The investigation therefore developed on two tracks at once. One track concerned the ransom and the people who would eventually handle it. The other concerned the victim himself and the information he might provide once released. The criminals had attempted to isolate Charles Urschel from the outside world, but the ransom letters had created a communication channel. They needed the family to know that Urschel was alive. They needed the family to understand that payment was expected. Every communication, therefore, carried information that investigators could study. The criminals had to communicate because they wanted money. And because they communicated, they gave investigators another way to understand the structure of the crime. The ransom demand also revealed the confidence of the kidnappers. They believed they could take a wealthy man, hold him for days, and demand $200, 000, without being caught. Their plan depended on secrecy and fear. But the authorities were quietly preparing to turn their greatest source of confidence, the ransom, itself into a vulnerability. The money would leave the hands of the family and enter the criminal world, but it would do so carrying a record of its identity. Later, when individual bills began to surface, investigators would be able to follow them. At the same time, Charles Urschel was continuing to collect another kind of evidence. He could not see the landscape, but he could remember the sounds and physical characteristics around him. He could not identify the road by sight, but he could remember the journey. He could not name the place where he was being held, but he could remember the well, the water, the machinery, the weather, and the aircraft passing overhead. The ransom and the victim's memory were therefore becoming two separate investigative paths leading toward the same destination. One was financial, the other was geographic. One depended on numbers printed on pieces of paper. The other depended on details stored in the mind of a blindfolded man. The kidnappers had demanded $200, 000, because they believed money would be the strongest force in the case. Instead, the money would become evidence. And while they focused on controlling Charles Urschel, they failed to understand that the victim himself was already gathering the information that would eventually help investigators find him. After approximately 9 days in captivity, Charles F. Urschel was released. The moment of his return marked a decisive change in the kidnapping investigation. Until then, the authorities had been forced to work around an absence. They knew that Urschel had been taken. They knew that the kidnappers wanted money. They had received letters connected with the ransom, but they did not know where the victim had been held. They did not know the exact route the kidnappers had taken after leaving Oklahoma City, and they did not know how far away from home Urschel had been transported. Now they had something they had not possessed before, the direct testimony of the victim. Yet Charles Urschel could not simply point to a location on a map and tell investigators where he had been. He had been blindfolded. He had spent his captivity without the normal visual information that would allow a witness to recognize streets, buildings, signs, or landscapes. The kidnappers had apparently believed that the blindfold would make their location impossible to identify. Instead, they had underestimated the value of the other senses. During those 9 days, Urschel had been paying attention. What he remembered was not one dramatic clue, but a collection of small details. The investigation now depended on whether those fragments could be transformed into something precise enough to locate a hidden property. Urschel described the journey and the environment around him. He remembered the sounds of engines and the amount of time involved in travel. He remembered the condition of the roads. He remembered the smell of oil. He noticed sounds associated with machinery. He remembered rain and other elements of the weather. He noticed animals around the place where he was being held. He remembered details of the house itself, including the number of stairs. He remembered a well and the sound associated with it. He even remembered the taste of the water. None of these observations, considered separately, was enough to solve the case. There could be many houses with stairs. There could be many wells. There could be many places where animals were present. Roads existed everywhere, and rain could fall across a wide region. Even the sound of machinery might initially seem too general to be useful. But the investigators did not need one clue that solved everything. They needed several clues that pointed in the same direction. The challenge was to compare Urschel's memories against information about the world outside. One of the most valuable memories involved aircraft. Urschel remembered hearing airplanes overhead at particular times while he was being held. To most people, an airplane passing overhead would be an ordinary event. To investigators trying to locate a blindfolded kidnapping victim, it could become a geographic marker. The Bureau of Investigation began examining airline schedules in an area extending approximately 600 miles around Oklahoma City. The investigators were looking for routes and flight times that could correspond with what Urschel remembered hearing. This was not a matter of simply finding an airport near a suspected property. The timing mattered. If Urschel could remember when aircraft passed overhead, then investigators could compare those memories with scheduled flights. A location that did not fit the schedule could be eliminated. A location that matched the schedule became more interesting. Among the information examined were American Airways flights operating between Fort Worth and Amarillo. The timing of those flights showed a significant correspondence with Urschel's recollections. The investigators now had something more concrete than a general memory of hearing planes. They had a potential geographic framework, but the investigation did not stop there. The weather became another piece of the invisible map. Urschel remembered rain during his captivity and remembered the condition of the roads. Those details could be compared with historical weather information. If the kidnappers had taken him to an area that had not experienced the kind of rain he remembered, that location could be rejected. If an area had experienced the appropriate weather at the appropriate time, it became more plausible. One location drew particular attention: Paradise, Texas. The area had experienced significant rainfall on July 30th, after a period of prolonged dry weather. The timing and conditions corresponded with Urschel's recollection of the weather and roads during his captivity. The combination of the aircraft schedules and the weather information began narrowing the investigation toward Wise County, Texas. This was a critical moment because the original search area had been enormous. The kidnappers had deliberately removed Urschel from Oklahoma City, and without his testimony, there was no obvious way to determine where they had taken him. Now, through details that had seemed almost insignificant while he was blindfolded, investigators were reducing the possibilities. The process was methodical. They were not relying on a dramatic confession or a single eyewitness who had seen the kidnappers drive into a particular property. They were reconstructing a hidden journey from fragments. The sound of an aircraft helped establish where Urschel might have been. Weather helped establish whether the timing made sense. Road conditions provided another comparison. The smell of oil suggested an environment connected with the industry that was familiar throughout the region. Sounds from machinery could further narrow the type of property. The physical features of the house could later provide an even stronger test. Each detail became part of a larger pattern. For Urschel, the process must have been unusual in another way. He had experienced these details without knowing their future significance. While he was captive, the sound of a plane was simply a sound. Rain was simply rain. A rough road was simply part of the journey. The water from a well was simply the water available to him. Only after his release could investigators begin asking whether these things corresponded to identifiable places. His memory had preserved information, but investigators had to translate that information into evidence. This was the point at which the kidnapping investigation began to change from a search for a missing man into a reconstruction of a physical location. The authorities were no longer asking only, where could the kidnappers have gone? They were asking a much more specific question: what place contains all of these details at the same time? That distinction mattered. A single clue could lead almost anywhere. Several matching clues could point to a particular area. The focus on Paradise and Wise County provided the investigators with a direction. The next task was to identify people and properties connected to the kidnappers. One name became especially important: Catherine Kelly. Investigators discovered that George Kelly's wife had connections to the Paradise area. That connection did not, by itself, prove that Charles Urschel had been held there, but it gave investigators a reason to look more closely. The geographic evidence and the criminal connections were beginning to converge. The investigation was moving toward the people who might have helped conceal Urschel. The FBI's task now became one of confirmation. If a property in the area could be found that matched the details remembered by Urschel, The case would take another major step forward. The investigators had already learned that memory could survive darkness. Now they needed to test that memory against the physical world. The next stage would involve examining the homes and farms associated with people connected to the case. The well, the cup, the stairs, the surrounding structures, and the other seemingly ordinary details would become more important than any dramatic clue. The kidnappers had attempted to hide Charles Urschel by taking away his sight. But the investigation had discovered that a location could still leave traces through sound. Weather, distance, smell, water, and structure. Urschel had been unable to see the road ahead of him, yet he had unknowingly recorded enough of the journey to help investigators follow it. The map did not exist on paper. It existed in his memory, and step by step, the Bureau of Investigation was learning how to read it. By the time investigators began focusing on the area around Paradise, Texas, the kidnapping of Charles F. Urschel had already begun to reveal a pattern. The case was no longer an unexplained disappearance in Oklahoma City. The memories Urschel had preserved during his captivity had given the Bureau of Investigation a geographic direction, and the connection between Catherine Kelly and the Paradise area gave investigators another reason to examine the people living there. The challenge now was to determine whether the physical evidence in that region could match what Urschel remembered. A criminal investigation can change direction when a single clue points toward a specific place. But that does not mean the case is solved. Investigators still need confirmation. They need to know whether the location is genuinely connected to the crime or whether the apparent connection is coincidence. In the Urschel case, that confirmation would come through ordinary objects and familiar structures that had taken on extraordinary importance. Investigators examined the home of R.G. Shannon and then looked more closely at a nearby farm belonging to his son, Armand Shannon. The property did not need to look like the center of a major kidnapping operation. In fact, that was part of what made it useful. The kidnappers had not needed a fortress. They needed a place where a captive could be kept away from public view. The investigators began comparing what they found at the property with what Urschel had described. One of the most important features was a well. Urschel had remembered the sound of water and other characteristics associated with the well during his captivity. The investigators also paid attention to objects that might have seemed completely ordinary under different circumstances. A metal bucket, a tin cup, a child's chair, and the arrangement of structures around the property. The significance of these objects came from their connection with a witness who had experienced the location while blindfolded. Urschel had not been able to look around and memorize the property visually. Instead, he had absorbed it through the details that remained available to him. When investigators found objects and structures corresponding to his memories, the possibility that this was the place where he had been held became much stronger. The case was now approaching a critical point. If Urschel could identify the property after his release, investigators would have a direct connection between the victim's experience and the location they had begun investigating. On August 12, 1933, federal agents moved against people connected with the suspected location and the kidnapping. One of those arrested was Harvey J. Bailey, a notorious criminal whose presence in the investigation represented another major development. Bailey was found with $1, $100, and $700 of that amount was identified as ransom money from the Urschel kidnapping. The discovery was significant because it connected the criminal investigation to the ransom itself. The money that had been prepared by authorities and whose serial numbers had been recorded was now appearing in the possession of people associated with the case. The ransom was no longer simply a demand made in a letter. It was physical evidence moving through the hands of the people involved. Bailey was also found with a machine gun and a handgun, adding to the seriousness of the evidence surrounding him. The arrests in Texas represented a major break. But investigators still needed to establish exactly how the people connected with the property were involved and whether the location itself was the place where Charles Urschel had been held. That question could be answered by the victim. Charles Urschel was brought to the area so that investigators could determine whether the surroundings matched his memories. This was an unusual form of identification. He was not being asked simply to look at a photograph and identify a suspect. He was being asked to recognize a place that he had experienced without being able to see it. Normally, his recognition would therefore test the invisible map he had created during captivity. As Urschel examined the property and its surroundings, he recognized the house where he had been held. He was able to identify details that corresponded with his memories, including the number of stairs and various objects around the property. He recognized the bucket and cup. He recognized the child's chair. He recognized the well and the sound associated with it. He remembered the taste of the water. He recognized characteristics of the animals and surroundings. He also identified the chain that had been used to restrain him. Each recognition strengthened the connection between the property and his captivity. What made this moment particularly important was that the kidnappers had attempted to prevent precisely this kind of identification. They had deprived Urschel of sight, apparently believing that a blindfold would make the location impossible for him to recognize later. Instead, the absence of sight had forced him to rely on other senses. The objects that surrounded him had become part of his memory. When he encountered those objects again, they provided confirmation. The investigation now had a physical location, a victim who could identify it, and evidence connecting the ransom money to people involved in the criminal network. Urschel also identified R.G. Shannon and Armand Shannon as individuals who had been involved in guarding him. Their names connected the physical location to the captivity itself. The investigation had moved from uncertainty to a chain of increasingly specific evidence. The kidnappers had not acted entirely alone. The involvement of the Shannon family demonstrated that the operation depended on people willing to provide a place where Urschel could be kept. That fact also changed the understanding of the crime. The kidnapping was not simply a single act carried out by two men who entered the Urschel home. It involved a broader network of people and locations. Some participants helped with the captivity. Others became connected to the ransom. Others helped conceal the criminals or their money. The investigation, therefore, had to expand beyond the original scene in Oklahoma City. It had become an interstate case. At the same time, another important suspect was brought into custody. Albert L. Bates was arrested in Denver on August 12th. He was found with $660, which was subsequently identified as part of the ransom money. Bates was identified as one of the men who had directly participated in the kidnapping along with George "Machine Gun" Kelly. His arrest added another important piece to the developing case against the group. The money provided a tangible connection, while Urschel's identification provided the connection between the suspects and the place of captivity. The investigation was beginning to close the space between the victim and the people who had taken him. But George Kelly himself remained at large. That meant that one of the central figures in the kidnapping was still beyond the reach of the authorities. The arrests in Texas and the identification of the Shannon property had not ended the case. They had transformed it into a manhunt. Investigators now knew more about the network, more about the location, and more about the movement of the ransom. They could begin following those connections outward. Every arrest could reveal another name. Every recovered bill could reveal another transaction. Every physical object could confirm another part of Urschel's story. The case was no longer dependent on a single breakthrough. It had become a chain, and each link made the next one easier to find. The Shannon property demonstrated how powerful small details could become when combined. A well, a cup, a chair, a staircase, a chain, and the taste of water were not dramatic pieces of evidence by themselves. But together, they formed a recognizable environment in the memory of the victim. The kidnappers had tried to create darkness around Charles Urschel. Instead, the darkness had forced him to notice details that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Now those details were helping investigators reconstruct the crime. The capture of Bailey, Bates, and members of the Shannon family marked a major collapse in the kidnapping network. Yet the central figure remained missing. George "Machine Gun" Kelly was still free, and Catherine Kelly was also still beyond the reach of the authorities. The investigation had found the place where Charles Urschel had been held. It had identified people connected with his captivity. It had begun recovering the ransom money. But the man whose name had become synonymous with the crime had not yet been captured. The next stage would be the search for George Kelly himself. The evidence was moving outward from Paradise, Texas, and the trail of the ransom money would become one of the tools used to follow it. What had begun as a kidnapping in a quiet Oklahoma City home was now becoming a nationwide pursuit. And with every recovered bill, every arrest, and every confirmed detail, the criminal network surrounding George Kelly was becoming smaller. By the middle of August 1933, the investigation into the kidnapping of Charles F. Urschel had changed completely. The case had begun with uncertainty, a wealthy Oklahoma City businessman taken from his home, 2 armed men disappearing into the night, and a family waiting for a ransom demand. Now the investigators had a location where Urschel had been held, people connected to that location, and portions of the ransom money recovered from members of the criminal network. But one of the most important figures in the case remained free. George "Machine Gun" Kelly had not been captured. His wife, Catherine Kelly, was also still at large. The investigation therefore entered its next phase, following the remaining evidence until it led to the people who had organized and carried out the kidnapping. One of the most useful forms of evidence was money. The kidnappers had demanded $200,000 because they believed the ransom would give them the reward they wanted. But the money carried a weakness they could not remove. Before the ransom was delivered, investigators had recorded the serial numbers of the $20 bills. That meant the bills could be recognized after they entered circulation. The kidnappers could move the money from one place to another, but they could not change the identity printed on each bill. As investigators began finding ransom money in the possession of people connected with the case, they could follow the movement of the currency and use it to identify further connections. The money became a trail extending beyond the original kidnapping. Some of the bills appeared in other places and became associated with transactions and people outside the immediate area of the Shannon property. One of the locations connected with the investigation was Minneapolis, where ransom money appeared and helped investigators trace a network of intermediaries and illegal transactions. Some of the money was connected with the illegal whiskey trade. The significance was not simply that stolen money had been spent. It was that the money could be connected back to the Urschel kidnapping through the recorded serial numbers. A bill that might appear to be ordinary currency to a shopkeeper or banker could become evidence to an investigator. The criminals had tried to turn the ransom into something anonymous. The serial numbers made it traceable. The trail also extended to Texas. A portion of the ransom money was discovered at the farm of Cassie Earl Coleman. Investigators ultimately recovered $73,250 hidden in a cotton field there. The discovery demonstrated how widely the ransom had been distributed and how many places had become connected with the crime. The kidnappers had not been able to keep the money in one secure location. It had moved through different hands, and each movement created another opportunity for investigators to follow the network. The more ransom money that surfaced, the harder it became for George and Catherine Kelly to disappear completely. At the same time, the earlier arrests had given investigators information about the structure of the kidnapping. Harvey Bailey had been arrested with ransom money. Albert Bates had been arrested in Denver with another portion of the ransom. Members of the Shannon family had been connected with the property where Urschel was held. Charles Urschel himself had identified the location and people involved in his captivity. These developments created a narrowing circle around the fugitives. George Kelly was no longer an unknown criminal somewhere in the country. He was a specific suspect connected to a specific kidnapping, and the investigators had physical evidence, witness testimony, and financial trails leading toward him. The hunt eventually brought the authorities to Memphis, Tennessee. By September 1933, investigators had determined that George Kelly was being concealed there. The months of uncertainty that had followed the kidnapping were coming to an end. The man who had become one of the most recognizable criminal figures in America was no longer protected by distance or secrecy. He was hiding in a particular city, inside a particular house, and federal agents were preparing to arrest him. In the early morning hours of September 26, 1933, FBI agents, working with Tennessee authorities, moved against the house in Memphis. The operation ended without the dramatic gun battle that might have been expected from the reputation surrounding Machine Gun Kelly. George Kelly surrendered. He did not resist the arrest, and he did not use a weapon against the officers. The contrast was striking. The man whose nickname was built around a machine gun had become famous as a dangerous criminal. Yet when the moment of capture arrived, the confrontation was comparatively quiet. The arrest immediately became part of the growing mythology surrounding the case. One of the most famous stories associated with Kelly's surrender is the phrase, "Don't shoot, G-Man." According to the popular version, Kelly said those words when he gave himself up to the federal agents. The phrase became closely connected with the image of the FBI and helped establish G-Man as a popular term for federal agents. But there is an important complication. The exact wording of Kelly's surrender has been questioned. The FBI itself later acknowledged that the famous phrase may have been exaggerated or transformed by later retellings. Early reports described Kelly's words differently. That uncertainty matters because it illustrates how quickly the facts of a major criminal case can become mixed with legend. George Kelly was already a recognizable figure, and the arrest created an opportunity for newspapers and popular culture to turn the event into a dramatic story. The image of a notorious gangster suddenly pleading with federal agents not to shoot was powerful. It fit perfectly with the emerging mythology of the federal government confronting organized crime. Whether Kelly actually used the exact phrase or not, the story became attached to him, and G-Men became increasingly associated with federal agents in American culture. Yet behind the legend was a much less glamorous reality. Kelly had been hunted because a man had been taken from his home and held for ransom. Charles Urschel had spent approximately 9 days in captivity. His family had endured uncertainty and fear. Investigators had followed the trail through physical evidence, witness memories, geography, and money. The arrest in Memphis was therefore not simply the capture of a famous gangster. It was the culmination of an investigation that had begun with the disappearance of an individual victim. The financial evidence had played a particularly important role in narrowing the network. The $200,000 ransom had initially represented the criminal's greatest objective. Instead, it became one of the strongest sources of evidence against them. The serial numbers recorded by investigators allowed portions of the money to be identified after they had been distributed. Those bills appeared in different locations and connected different people to the broader operation. The ransom, therefore, became a thread that could be followed from one participant to another. The geography of the investigation had also expanded dramatically. The kidnapping began in Oklahoma City. Urschel was held in Texas. Ransom money appeared in other places, including Minneapolis, while Albert Bates was arrested in Denver. George and Catherine Kelly were eventually located in Memphis. The case demonstrated the difficulty of investigating criminal activity that crossed state boundaries. A local kidnapping could quickly become an interstate investigation involving multiple law enforcement agencies and jurisdictions. That was one reason the case became so significant for the Bureau of Investigation. The investigation also demonstrated the value of combining different types of evidence. Urschel's memories helped investigators locate the place where he had been held. Physical objects and structures supported his identification. Ransom money connected suspects to the crime. Arrests revealed additional participants. The pieces did not stand alone. They reinforced one another. By the time George Kelly was captured, the case had developed into a network of evidence rather than a single accusation. His arrest also brought the investigation closer to its final stage. The suspects would now face the consequences of the kidnapping in court. The public fascination with Machine Gun Kelly would continue. But the legal process would focus on the crime itself, the abduction of Charles Urschel, the demand for $200,000, the involvement of multiple people, and the evidence that had been collected over the preceding weeks. The famous nickname, the Machine Gun, and the stories surrounding the arrest could attract headlines. But they were not the heart of the case. The heart of the case was a man taken from his home and held against his will. The investigation had begun by asking where Charles Urschel was. It had answered that question. Then it had asked who had taken him. Now, with George and Catherine Kelly in custody and several accomplices already arrested, the authorities could finally prepare to answer that question in court. The arrest of George Machine Gun Kelly and Catherine Kelly on September 26, 1933, brought the manhunt to an end, but it did not bring the Charles F. Urschel case to an end. The kidnapping had begun more than 2 months earlier, on a quiet July night in Oklahoma City, when armed men entered the Urschel home and forced Charles Urschel and Walter R. Jarrett into a waiting Chevrolet. Since then, the investigation had crossed state lines, uncovered a network of people connected to the crime, recovered portions of the $200,000 ransom, and reconstructed the place where Urschel had been held. Now the case moved into its final stage, the courtroom. On October 12, 1933, George Kelly and Catherine Kelly were convicted in connection with the kidnapping and sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence marked the formal conclusion of the central legal case against the couple, but it also reflected the larger significance of what investigators had uncovered. The kidnapping had not been the work of two people acting in complete isolation. Other individuals had been involved in the operation, either by participating directly, helping guard Urschel, concealing the criminals, or handling the ransom money. The evidence gathered during the investigation therefore produced consequences for a much wider group. Harvey Bailey, Albert Bates, R.G. Shannon, and Oris Shannon received life sentences. Armand Shannon received a sentence of 10 years probation, while Barney Berman and Clifford Skelly received 5-year sentences. Other prosecutions followed as authorities continued examining the people who had helped conceal members of the group or otherwise assisted them. The different sentences reflected the different roles attributed to the people connected with the kidnapping, but together they demonstrated how extensively the investigation had expanded. What had begun with 2 armed men entering the Urschel home had become a much larger criminal case. The evidence against the group had been assembled through several different methods. The ransom money was one of the clearest examples. Before the money was delivered, investigators had recorded the serial numbers of the $20 bills. That decision allowed them to recognize the money after it moved through the criminal network. Bills recovered from Harvey Bailey, Albert Bates, and other locations provided connections that might otherwise have been difficult to establish. The money was no longer simply a payment demanded by the kidnappers. It had become a record of their movements. Investigators could follow it as it passed from one person to another, connecting individuals and transactions to the original kidnapping. But perhaps the most remarkable evidence came from Charles Urschel himself. When the kidnappers blindfolded him, they had apparently intended to prevent him from identifying the place where he was being held. Instead, Urschel compensated for the loss of sight by paying close attention to the world around him. During approximately 9 days of captivity, he remembered sounds, smells, weather, roads, machinery, animals, stairs, the well, the water, and aircraft passing overhead. After his release, those memories became a guide for investigators. The FBI examined airline schedules within a broad area around Oklahoma City and found that American Airways flights between Fort Worth and Amarillo corresponded with the times Urschel remembered. Hearing airplanes, investigators then compared his recollections with weather information. The rainfall in the Paradise, Texas, area on July 30th, following a period of dry weather, matched the conditions he had described. Those details helped narrow the search toward Wise County. Then the investigation turned toward the people connected with the area. Catherine Kelly had connections to Paradise, and investigators examined the homes and property associated with R.G. Shannon and his son, Armand Shannon. The physical details of the property matched the memories Urschel had preserved. A well, a metal bucket, a child's chair, the arrangement of the buildings, the stairs, the surrounding animals, the water, the chain that had been used to restrain him. These were ordinary objects, but together they provided extraordinary confirmation. Urschel recognized the property where he had been held and identified R.G. Shannon and Armand Shannon as people who had guarded him. His testimony transformed what might otherwise have been circumstantial clues into a coherent account of his captivity. It is easy, after the fact, to describe this as an inevitable investigative success. But the case had not been inevitable. The kidnappers had deliberately created uncertainty. They had removed Urschel from his home, transported him away from Oklahoma City, blindfolded him, and concealed him at a location that investigators initially did not know. The fact that the authorities were eventually able to find him depended on their willingness to treat small details as meaningful evidence. It also depended on Urschel's ability to remain attentive under conditions designed to disorient him. His role in solving the case was therefore fundamental. He was not simply the victim who waited to be rescued. His memories became one of the central investigative tools used to reconstruct his own captivity. At the same time, the case demonstrated the importance of cooperation across jurisdictions. The kidnapping began in Oklahoma City. The place of captivity was identified in Texas. Albert Bates was arrested in Denver. Ransom money surfaced in other locations, including Minneapolis. And George and Catherine Kelly were ultimately found in Memphis. The criminal network moved across state boundaries, and the investigation had to follow it. The case illustrated why federal law enforcement was becoming increasingly important in the fight against organized crime. The Bureau of Investigation had been able to coordinate information across different locations and pursue evidence that did not remain inside one local jurisdiction. The story of George Kelly, however, did not end with his conviction. After receiving a life sentence, he remained within the federal prison system and was eventually transferred to Alcatraz. He died in 1954 at a federal hospital in Springfield, Missouri, after his health declined. The criminal who had become famous as Machine Gun Kelly ultimately spent his final years far removed from the image that had surrounded him during the Depression. His nickname had suggested violence and power. His capture had helped create the popular legend of the G-Men. But the reality of his later life was much less dramatic: imprisonment, declining health, and death in federal custody. The phrase, "don't shoot, G-Men," also became part of that legend. The story of Kelly supposedly saying the words when he surrendered became famous, but the exact wording has been questioned. The FBI itself later acknowledged that the popular version may have been exaggerated. That uncertainty is worth remembering because the public image of a criminal can sometimes become larger than the facts of the crime itself. Newspapers could turn Kelly into a symbol, and the phrase associated with his surrender could help create an enduring image of federal agents confronting a notorious gangster. But beneath the legend was the experience of Charles Urschel. He had been taken from his home, separated from his family, and held captive for approximately 9 days. His ordeal was not a story about glamour or criminal fame. It was a story about fear, uncertainty, endurance, and the extraordinary usefulness of memory. The final significance of the Urschel kidnapping therefore extends beyond the life of George Kelly. The case showed how a kidnapping could be investigated through a combination of human testimony, physical evidence, financial records, weather information, transportation schedules, and cooperation between authorities. It demonstrated that evidence did not always arrive in the form of a dramatic confession or a weapon found at a crime scene. Sometimes it was a $20 bill whose serial number had been recorded. Sometimes it was the sound of an airplane heard by a blindfolded victim. Sometimes it was the taste of water from a well. Sometimes it was the number of stairs inside a house. The criminals had attempted to erase the trail by controlling what Charles Urschel could see. But they could not control what he remembered. That is perhaps the most enduring lesson of the case. The kidnapping was built on the assumption that secrecy would protect the perpetrators. Instead, the smallest details gradually dismantled that secrecy. The money left a trail. The suspects left connections. The landscape left clues. And Charles Urschel carried an invisible map out of captivity in his memory. In the end, George Machine Gun Kelly became famous for his nickname, his criminal reputation, and the legend surrounding his arrest. But the deeper story belongs to the man whose life was disrupted by the crime and whose ability to observe helped bring it to an end. Charles Urschel entered that July night as a wealthy businessman enjoying an ordinary evening with friends. He emerged from captivity as the central witness to a crime that would become a landmark in American criminal investigation. His kidnappers had tried to make him disappear. Instead, his memory helped make them visible. And when the case finally reached the courtroom, the story was no longer about a man who had vanished into darkness. It was about how that man had remembered his way back. The conviction of George Machine Gun Kelly and Catherine Kelly did not simply close a criminal case. It marked the end of a kidnapping that had begun with a few terrifying minutes inside Charles F. Urschel's Oklahoma City home and developed into an investigation stretching across several states. By October 12, 1933, the authorities had established a chain of evidence connecting the kidnappers, their associates, the place where Urschel had been held, and the ransom money that had passed through their hands. The central figures were now facing life imprisonment, while other participants had received different sentences according to their involvement. For Charles Urschel, however, the conclusion of the trial could never erase what had happened on the night of July 22nd. The legal process could identify the people responsible, but it could not return the ordinary evening that had existed before the two armed men entered his home. The kidnapping had begun while Urschel and his wife were playing bridge with Walter or Jared and Jared's wife. Within minutes, the atmosphere of an ordinary social gathering had been replaced by fear and armed control. Two men had appeared, one carrying a machine gun and the other a handgun. They had asked for Urschel by name and forced him from his home. Jared had been taken as well, because the kidnappers initially could not determine which man was their intended target. Approximately 12 miles away, Jared was released, but only after the kidnappers took $50 and warned him not to reveal the direction in which they had traveled. Urschel remained in captivity. The simplicity of those first actions concealed the complexity that would follow. The kidnappers believed that by removing Urschel from his home and preventing him from seeing his surroundings, they could control the investigation. They were correct about one thing. The family and authorities initially had no idea where he had been taken. But they were wrong about the value of the victim's memory. The 9 days Urschel spent in captivity became the foundation of one of the most remarkable elements of the investigation. His blindfold did not erase his surroundings. Instead, it forced him to experience them differently. He remembered the sounds of engines, the condition of roads, the smell of oil, machinery, animals, rainfall, stairs, a well, water, and airplanes passing overhead. None of these details was dramatic in isolation, yet their combined value was extraordinary. After his release, investigators could compare those memories with information about the world outside. Airline schedules became relevant because Urschel remembered aircraft at particular times. American Airways flights between Fort Worth and Amarillo provided a possible match. Weather records became relevant because he remembered rain and road conditions. The rainfall around Paradise, Texas, on July 30th corresponded with his recollections after a period of dry weather. Slowly, the search moved toward Wise County. The investigation then became a process of testing memory against physical reality. The homes and property connected with the Shannon family were examined. Ordinary objects became evidence because Urschel could recognize them. The well, the bucket, the tin cup, the child's chair, the stairs, the surrounding animals, and the chain used to restrain him all helped confirm that investigators had found the place where he had been held. Urschel identified R.G. Shannon and Armand Shannon as people connected with guarding him. This was not simply a discovery of a suspicious property. It was the identification of the physical environment in which the kidnapping had continued after. Urschel was removed from Oklahoma City. At almost the same time, the ransom itself was becoming a second investigative map. The kidnappers had demanded $200,000, an enormous sum in 1933. Authorities prepared the ransom using used $20 bills and recorded the serial numbers. That decision meant that the money could later be recognized even after it had been dispersed. The kidnappers might move the bills, but the investigators could still identify them. Harvey J. Bailey was arrested with $1,100, including $700 identified as Urschel ransom money. Albert L. Bates was arrested in Denver with $660 that was also identified as ransom money. Another $73,250 was found hidden in a cotton field at the farm of Cassie Earl Coleman. The money therefore created a trail extending beyond the place where Urschel had been held. It showed that the ransom had moved through different people and locations. The investigation was no longer based only on what suspects said. The physical currency itself was providing connections. This was particularly important because the kidnapping involved a network rather than a single, isolated perpetrator. The participation of the Shannon family, Bailey, Bates, and others demonstrated that the crime depended on cooperation. Someone had to guard the victim. Someone had to move or conceal the money. Someone had to provide places of refuge. The kidnappers had created a structure designed to keep Charles Urschel hidden. But that same structure created more opportunities for investigators to find connections. Every additional person represented another possible source of evidence. Every recovered ransom bill represented another movement that could be reconstructed. The capture of George and Catherine Kelly in Memphis on September 26th brought the search for the central figures to an end. Their surrender also created one of the most enduring legends connected with the case. The phrase, "Don't shoot." G-men became associated with Kelly's arrest and helped establish the popular image of federal agents as G-men. Yet the exact phrase remains uncertain. The FBI later acknowledged that the famous version may have been exaggerated, while earlier reports described Kelly's words differently. The distinction between the documented event and the later legend is important. The real significance of the arrest did not depend on a dramatic sentence shouted by a gangster. It depended on the fact that the man investigators had pursued since the kidnapping was finally in custody. The case had reached the point where the evidence could be presented in court. On October 12th, George and Catherine Kelly were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Harvey Bailey, Albert Bates, R.G. Shannon, and Ora Shannon also received life sentences. Armand Shannon received 10 years of probation, while Barney Berman and Clifford Skelly were sentenced to 5 years. Other prosecutions followed against people who had helped conceal members of the group. The different sentences reflected the wider network that had emerged from the investigation. The legal consequences did not end with the two people whose names had become most famous. The entire structure surrounding the kidnapping had been exposed. Yet the story of George Kelly continued after the courtroom. His life sentence did not mean that the public image surrounding him disappeared immediately. The nickname Machine Gun Kelly had already become part of American criminal folklore. But imprisonment gradually replaced the image of a powerful fugitive with the reality of a man under federal custody. Kelly was eventually transferred to Alcatraz. He remained within the federal prison system for the rest of his life. In 1954, he died at a federal hospital in Springfield, Missouri, after his health declined. The end was distant from the image created around him in 1933. The criminal who had once been associated with a machine gun, kidnapping, and a massive ransom eventually died in federal custody, far removed from the night when Charles Urschel was taken from his home. That contrast is one of the clearest reminders that criminal notoriety is temporary. while the consequences of crime can last much longer. For Urschel and his family, the kidnapping was not a newspaper story or a legend. It was a personal violation that began inside their own home. The trial could establish responsibility, but it could not make the event disappear. The most enduring aspect of the case may therefore be not the reputation of George Kelly, but the evidence provided by the victim. Urschel demonstrated an extraordinary ability to retain useful information under circumstances designed to prevent him from doing exactly that. He had been blindfolded, but he listened. He could not see the roads, but he noticed how they felt. He could not inspect the property, but he remembered its objects and structures. He could not read a map, but he created one through sound, weather, smell, distance, and memory. The kidnappers had attempted to turn him into a witness who could say almost nothing. Instead, he became the person whose observations helped investigators locate the place of captivity. The Urschel kidnapping also demonstrated that an investigation could be built from evidence that appeared insignificant at first. A serial number on a $20 bill, the timing of an aircraft, a rainfall event, the taste of water, a staircase, a metal cup, a well, a chain. Each detail was small. Together, they formed a coherent picture. That method became part of the broader significance of the case. The investigation showed how financial evidence, witness testimony, geography, weather information, transportation schedules, and physical observations could be combined to reconstruct a crime that had initially seemed almost impossible to trace. The criminals had relied on secrecy, but secrecy was not absolute. Every movement created information. Every location contained details. Every transaction left a trace. And every memory preserved by the victim could eventually be compared with the physical world. The story of the Urschel kidnapping therefore ended with more than convictions. It left behind a lesson about the limits of concealment. George Kelly and his associates had believed that distance and darkness could protect them. They were wrong. Charles Urschel remembered. The investigators followed those memories. The ransom money left its own trail. And eventually, the hidden structure of the crime became visible. What began with one man's disappearance ended with an entire network exposed. Several criminals imprisoned, and a case that would remain closely associated with the rise of the G-Men in American public consciousness. The Charles F. Urschel kidnapping ended in court. But the most important outcome of the case had already happened before the verdicts were delivered. Charles F. Urschel had come home. On July 22, 1933, he had been taken from the safety of his own house by armed men who entered without warning. Approximately 9 days later, he was released. Between those two moments, his life had been reduced to a series of unknowns. He did not know where he was. He did not know how long he would remain captive. He did not know what would happen to him if the ransom was not paid. His family, meanwhile, could do little more than wait for instructions from people who had demonstrated that they were willing to use violence. The kidnappers had expected their control over Urschel to give them power. They believed that the blindfold, the distance, the secrecy, and the fear surrounding the ransom would protect them. But the case ultimately demonstrated the limits of that control. Charles Urschel survived the captivity, and when he returned, he brought something with him that the kidnappers had failed to take away: his memory. That memory became one of the central reasons the investigation succeeded. The story of the Urschel kidnapping is therefore not simply the story of George "Machine Gun" Kelly and his criminal associates. It is the story of what happened when an ordinary person's ability to observe under extraordinary circumstances became more powerful than the precautions designed to silence him. The kidnappers had taken away Urschel's sight, but they had not taken away his ability to listen. They had transported him without allowing him to see the roads, but they had not prevented him from noticing how long the journeys lasted or how the roads felt. They had kept him inside a hidden property, but they had not prevented him from noticing the sound of the well, the taste of the water, the stairs, the objects around him, the animals, the machinery, or the aircraft passing overhead. Each detail remained in his mind until investigators could compare it with the physical world. The resulting investigation was remarkable because it did not depend upon one perfect clue. It depended upon the accumulation of details. A single sound could have meant almost nothing. A single weather observation could have applied to many places. A single staircase could have existed in countless houses. But when those details were considered together, they began to identify a particular environment. The investigators studied airline schedules and found that flights between Fort Worth and Amarillo corresponded with Urschel's recollections of aircraft overhead. They compared his memories with weather conditions and found that the Paradise, Texas, area had experienced rainfall that matched what he remembered. The search narrowed toward Wise County. Then physical objects provided further confirmation. The well, the metal bucket, the tin cup, the child's chair, the stairs, the surrounding animals, the chain, the water. These were not spectacular pieces of evidence. They were the ordinary details of a property. But to Charles Urschel, they were familiar because he had encountered them during the most frightening period of his life. When he recognized the property, the invisible map he had carried out of captivity became a physical location. That discovery changed the investigation. The authorities could now connect the victim's account to a specific place and to people associated with it. R.G. Shannon and Armand Shannon were identified as individuals involved in guarding Urschel. Harvey J. Bailey was arrested with ransom money. Albert L. Bates was arrested in Denver with another portion of the ransom. More money was discovered elsewhere, including $73, $250 hidden in a cotton field at Cassie Earl Coleman's farm. The ransom itself had become another form of evidence. Before the money was delivered, investigators had recorded the serial numbers of the $20 bills. That simple precaution transformed ordinary currency into traceable evidence. As the bills moved through different hands and locations, they provided investigators with additional connections. The kidnappers had wanted the money because it represented freedom and profit. Instead, the money became part of the trail leading investigators toward the people involved in the crime. The investigation eventually led to Memphis, Tennessee, where George and Catherine Kelly were found and arrested on September 26, 1933. George Kelly surrendered without resistance. The arrest became surrounded by the famous story that he said, "Don't shoot, G-men." Yet the exact wording of the surrender is uncertain, and the FBI later acknowledged that the popular version may have been exaggerated. Still, the phrase became attached to the event and helped establish G-man as a familiar term for federal agents. The legend grew quickly, but the underlying reality was simpler. Federal investigators had pursued an interstate kidnapping network and had finally located the people at the center of it. The arrest allowed the case to move into the courtroom. On October 12th, George and Catherine Kelly were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Other participants also faced serious consequences. Harvey Bailey, Albert Bates, R.G. Shannon, and Oris Shannon received life sentences. Armand Shannon received 10 years of probation, while Barney Berman and Clifford Skelly received 5-year sentences. Other prosecutions followed involving people who had assisted members of the group or helped conceal them. The legal outcome demonstrated that the kidnapping had not been an isolated act carried out by two men. It had depended on a network of people, locations, money, and cooperation. Once investigators began separating those connections and following them one by one, the network became increasingly difficult to conceal. The case also demonstrated the importance of cooperation across state boundaries. Oklahoma City was the starting point, but the investigation extended into Texas and then reached other locations connected to the movement of the ransom and the suspects. Albert Bates was arrested in Denver. Ransom money appeared in Minneapolis. George and Catherine Kelly were found in Memphis. The criminal operation crossed state lines, and the investigation had to do the same. The case, therefore, became an important example of the growing role of federal investigation in confronting criminals whose activities did not remain within a single local jurisdiction. Yet even with all of those investigative achievements, the person at the center of the story remains Charles Urschel. It is easy for history to remember the name Machine Gun Kelly because it is dramatic, recognizable, and connected with the mythology of Depression-era crime. But the reason Kelly became famous in this case was because he participated in a crime against another human being. Charles Urschel was the person whose life was interrupted. He was the person taken from his home. He was the person forced into captivity. He was the person who had to endure approximately 9 days without knowing what would happen next. And he was the person who, despite those circumstances, preserved the information that eventually helped investigators reconstruct the crime. His experience also provides a different way of understanding courage. There was no dramatic confrontation in which Urschel overpowered his captors. There was no single moment when he escaped through force. His contribution was quieter. He paid attention. He remembered. He refused to allow the blindfold to become complete isolation. In circumstances where the kidnappers believed that they controlled what he could know, he continued gathering information. His memory became a form of resistance. The case also reminds us that victims do not always know which details will matter. Urschel could not have known that an aircraft schedule might later help investigators identify his location. He could not have known that rainfall in paradise would become relevant. He could not have known that the taste of water or the sound of a well would help confirm a property. He simply remembered what he experienced. Investigators then transformed those memories into evidence. That process is perhaps the most enduring investigative lesson of the entire case. Facts do not always announce their importance immediately. Sometimes they become meaningful only when placed beside other facts. The Urschel case was solved through that accumulation. A ransom letter, recorded serial numbers, recovered currency, witness testimony, weather information, airline schedules, physical objects, the victim's memory. Each element strengthened the others. By the time the major suspects were brought to justice, the case had developed into a coherent chain connecting the kidnapping to its perpetrators. George Kelly eventually remained in federal custody for the rest of his life. He was transferred to Alcatraz and later died in 1954 at a federal hospital in Springfield, Missouri, after his health declined. The criminal whose name had once filled newspapers eventually became another prisoner who died far removed from the public image that had surrounded him. The machine gun, the nickname, and the legend of the G-Men could not change the basic outcome. Charles Urschel survived. The kidnappers were identified. The criminal network was dismantled through arrests and prosecutions. And the ransom that had been intended to finance escape became evidence that helped expose the people who handled it. In the end, the most powerful image left by the case is not that of a gangster holding a weapon. It is the image of a man who could not see, yet remembered. The kidnappers believed darkness would protect them. It did not. They believed distance would hide the place where they had taken Urschel. It did not. They believed money would provide their escape. Instead, the serial numbers on that money helped investigators follow their trail. They believed that controlling one victim meant controlling the story. Instead, Charles Urschel became one of the most important witnesses in the investigation. The case began with a question: where had Charles Urschel gone? It ended with answers that reached far beyond his location. Investigators discovered where he had been held, identified the people who had guarded him, traced the ransom through the criminal network, arrested George and Catherine Kelly, and brought the principal participants before the courts. But perhaps the simplest conclusion is also the most important. Charles Urschel was taken from his home, but he was not erased. He was carried into darkness, but he carried his memories with him. And when he returned, those memories helped illuminate the path that led investigators back to the men who had believed they could disappear.